The sky over Germany was no longer theirs. By the winter of 1944, what had once been the proud domain of the Luftwaffe had become a place of death. The blue expanse that once roared with Mehmeds and Folks was now filled with American bombers and their escorts, streaming eastward by the hundreds. The air superiority that Germany had once claimed in the early years of the war over Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, and the fields of France was gone. Every flight now was an act of survival, not dominance. The Third Reich was collapsing on all fronts. Allied troops had crossed into the Rhineland. The Soviets were sweeping across Poland. German cities lay in ruins, pounded daily by bombers from Britain and the United States. The Luftwaffe, the once fearsome air arm that had terrorized Europe, was a shadow of its former self. By late 1944, its aces were dead, its veterans scattered, its aircraft supply crippled, and its fuel reserves nearly exhausted. Yet, the Nazi leadership demanded one last miracle. What followed would become one of the most tragic and futile episodes of the war. The Luftwaffe's final mobilization, its last flight, flown not by men hardened in battle, but by boys barely old enough to shave. At the height of its power in 1940, the Luftwaffe had been the envy of the world. Under Hermann Göring's bomberstand, Adolf Gehland's tactical brilliance, it had spearheaded victories from Norway to Cree. Its pilots were elite, its aircraft cutting edge, but the Battle of Britain had shown the first cracks. When the Luftwaffe failed to break the RAF, Germany lost not only a campaign, but the foundation of future air supremacy. In the years that followed, the war spread faster than the Luftwaffe could recover. Stalingrad, North Africa, Italy, the front lines multiplied. Fighter units were drawn thin. Pilots overworked and killed faster than they could be replaced. Training standards plummeted. The elite Jagdgeschwader fighter wings, once filled with the cream of German aviation, became revolving doors for the young and inexperienced. By 1944, the Allied bombing campaign had become relentless. American B-17s and B-24s struck by day, British Lancasters by night. Oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, and rail yards vanished under tonnage of explosives. The Luftwaffe fought back desperately, but every interception costed irreplaceable pilots. In February 1944, during what the Allies called Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost over a third of its remaining fighter strength. For Germany, it was an invisible death spiral. Aircraft production actually rose by sheer will and slave labor, but fuel vanished. Experienced instructors were sent to the front. Cadets received fewer flight hours, sometimes as little as 20, before being sent into combat. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, and Hitler's demands only grew more delusional. By late 1944, Göring was a caricature of his former self, bloated, erratic, terrified of losing favor. He promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would rise again. He pointed to the new wonder weapons, the Messerschmitt May 262 jet, the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, as proof that Germany could still command their skies. But these machines, advanced as they were, came too late. There was no fuel to fly them, no time to train pilots to handle their blistering speed. So their Gym turned to its last reserve, their youth. The call went out through the Hitler-Jugend, the Hitler Youth. Boys as young as 15, indoctrinated for years with fantasies of glory and sacrifice, were summoned to join the fight for the fatherland. Some were already manning anti-aircraft batteries on rooftops, others helping clear rubble from bombed-out streets. Now they would become pilots. Officially, the plan was part of Operation Bodenplatte, Hitler's last great air offensive designed to Allied air power on the ground and buy time for his faltering armies. But behind the grandiose name was a desperate improvisation. The Luftwaffe no longer had men. It had children. Training schools became crash courses. The Luftwaffe's once rigorous flight curriculum, hundreds of hours in gliders and trainers, was cut to mere weeks. Instructors shouted over the roar of engines, as boys struggled to control outdated aircraft. Accidents were constant. The statistics were appalling. Nearly half of all trainee pilots died in training before ever meeting an enemy in the air. Those who survived were given worn-out BF-19s or FTW-90s with unreliable engines and no radios. They were told to fly straight at the bombers, fire what ammunition they had, and if necessary, ram. The result was a generation of aerial martyrs. One of them was 17-year-old Willy Resker, who flew with Jagdgeschwader 301. He recalled arriving at his unit in December 1944. We were boys surrounded by ghosts. The older pilots were gone. The few who remained looked at us with pity. His first flight lasted only minutes before his squadron came under attack by P-51 Mustangs. He survived by diving into cloud, but half his comrades did not return. Others never even reached the front. In January 1945, as the Allies advanced into Germany, airfields were strafed daily. Takeoff meant exposure, landing meant death. The Luftwaffe had become a suicide service. On New Year's Day 1945, Hitler ordered the Great Gamble. Operation Bodenplot would be the last major Luftwaffe offensive of the war. Nearly 900 aircraft, many flown by teenagers and barely trained men, were to attack Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. It was meant to coincide with the Battle of the Bulge, striking the Allies when they least expected it. Before dawn, the airfields of northern Germany came alive. Pilots climbed into cockpits heavy with frost. Mechanics shouted last blessings. The engines coughed to life. For a moment, the Luftwaffe seemed reborn, the roar of hundreds of aircraft echoing through the cold air like the ghosts of 1940. But the illusion shattered quickly. Navigation errors, fog, and inexperience turned the operation into chaos. Some units bombed the wrong airfields. Others collided mid-air. Anti-aircraft gunners. German gunners fired on their own planes, mistaking them for Allied raiders. When the smoke cleared, their assaults were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe destroyed some 300 Allied aircraft on the ground, but lost over 280 of its own, most of them irreplaceable fighters and their young pilots. The attack that was meant to revive the Luftwaffe instead annihilated it. After Bodenplot, there was nothing left to rebuild. By February 1945, Germany's air defense network had collapsed entirely. Cities burned unchecked under waves of bombers. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper. Hundreds of aircraft rolled out of factories every month, but they had no pilots and no fuel. The situation bordered on absurd. In some training centers, boys sat in their cockpits making airplane noises, engines empty, fuel tanks dry. Göring continued to promise miracles. Hitler ordered the creation of emergency fighter groups to be composed of anyone who could hold a stick. Some of these groups consisted of Luftwaffe ground crew, others of schoolboys. Their mission: intercept bombers with whatever could fly. In March, the German Air Ministry approved the so-called Volkswagen program, People's Fighter. The idea was to mass-produce a cheap jet that even untrained pilots could fly. The result was the Hankel He-162, a small wooden aircraft powered by a single jet engine mounted above the fuselage. It was fast, sleek, and lethal to its own pilots. The He-162 entered service in April 1945, too late to matter. Most of its young pilots had less than 5 hours of jet flight time. They took off from airfields already under artillery fire. Many died not in combat but from structural failure or inexperience. The Luftwaffe's last aircraft were being flown by boys into oblivion. One of them, a 16-year-old pilot named Paul Heinemann, wrote in his diary before a mission, "Tomorrow I fly against the enemy. I know I will not return, but I am not afraid. They say we are Germany's last hope. I will do my duty." He took off the next morning and was never seen again. These were not isolated stories. Across Germany, the airfields of Schleswig, Bavaria, and Saxony became graveyards for children. The average Luftwaffe pilot in 1945 was 19. Many were younger. Some, like those of Jagoschwaderson 03, never fired a shot before being shot down themselves. By April, with Berlin surrounded, the Luftwaffe's final units ceased to exist. The last operational jet sortie took place on April 30th, the same day Hitler shot himself in his bunker. 2 Mai 262, Sowjetverband 44, scrambled to intercept bombers near Munich. They destroyed one B-17, then were themselves destroyed by Allied fighters. It was the final victory of the Luftwaffe and its finalos. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the surviving Luftwaffe officers were herded into captivity. Göring was arrested and later tried at Nuremberg. Many of the surviving pilots were scarcely adults. They wandered home through the ruins of their cities in disbelief. The airfields where they had trained were now littered with wrecks. Jets, prop planes, gliders, all abandoned. Some aircraft never even left the ground. Mechanics drained their remaining fuel into bottles to trade for food. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had begun the war with 20,000 aircraft and the most advanced technology in the world, ended it as a memory. For the boys who survived, the trauma would last a lifetime. Some were too young to understand the ideology they had fought for. Others had believed sincerely in a cause that had betrayed them. In post-war interviews, many described the same haunting contradiction: pride in having flown and shame in having done so for Hitler. Historians would later call them the Kinderpiloten, the child pilots. Their story was buried under the broader narrative of Germany's defeat, overshadowed by the ruins of Berlin and the horrors of the concentration camps. Yet within that forgotten corner of history lies a mirror of the Reich's madness, the willingness to sacrifice its own children for a lost dream. The Luftwaffe's last flight was not a strategic operation. It was a national suicide note written in contrails. Today it is difficult to comprehend the scale of that collapse. In 1940, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies of Europe with confidence and skill. By 1945, its pilots were teenagers who had learned to fly from manuals fighting an aircraft built from plywood and desperation. The transformation was total, not only technological but moral. The same state that had once celebrated its pilots, as knights of the air, had turned them into expendable tools. Behind every photograph of a grinning young pilot in 1945 stands a machine that sent him toady in a hopeless war he could not even understand. The tragedy was compounded by futility. By the time the final jets took off, Germany's defeat was certain. No amount of courage could alter the physics of numbers. The Allies had thousands of aircraft and limitless fuel. Germany had almost none. Every sortie was a gesture of denial. Yet even in this hopelessness, the Luftwaffe's last flights were acts of extraordinary human resolve. Many of the boys knew they were flying to their deaths. They flew anyway. Sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of indoctrination, but sometimes simply because it was all they knew. They had grown up in war. They didn't know a world without it. When the war ended, those who survived faced a lifetime of silence. They returned to homes that no longer existed, to a nation that preferred to forget. The uniform they had once worn with pride became a mark of guilt. Their friends were gone, their youth stolen. For the rest of their lives, they carried the memory of that final winter. The frozen airfields, the empty fuel drums, the sound of engines coughing in the cold, the sight of comrades never returning. The Luftwaffe's final flight was not thestry of glory, but of collapse, of how a nation consumed by ideology burned through everything it had, including its children, in the name of victory. And when those last aircraft fell silent, so too did the myth of German invincibility. The sky that had once echoed with terror of the Luftwaffe became quiet. In that silence lay the final truth that courage, when chained to madness, leads only to ruin.